The snow swallowed the prairie and the trail both. But under it all, one cowboy kept hauling firewood through a tunnel nobody else knew existed. Before we ride deeper, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if the frontier still speaks to you, hitch your horse and stay for tomorrow's tale. The wind screamed across the plains like an angry beast, and the snow followed close behind, cutting through the world like a blade. Eli Mercer knelt in the thickening snow, his breath fogging before his face, his boots nearly swallowed by the powder. His gloved hands gripped firewood close to his chest, his shoulders hunched against the freeze that clawed through his coat down into his bones. But the snow didn't matter, not to him. He stood, turned, and lowered himself into the tunnel. The wind howled louder now. The blizzard was full, its fury in the way it howled through the trees and rattled the window panes of cabins that were already disappearing beneath the drifts. A dozen miles south, the others would be locking doors, doubling down on their stoves, and praying they had enough firewood to last through the night. The word would get around Eli Mercer. That stubborn cowboy had done something foolish again. He'd gone and built himself a shelter that was too deep for comfort. The tunnel's entrance was hidden behind the barn, just a few feet under the ground. Eli had built it with his hands, careful and slow. He hadn't said much about it to the others. Let them mock him. Let them laugh at the fool who dug below the surface instead of piling wood high. When the snow came, he'd be ready. Now, the only sound was the rhythmic thump of his boots in the cold, then silence. He paused beneath the earth. The warmth of the cabin was still a few yards away, but it was enough. He reached for the lantern, feeling his way along the walls, the stone and timber that held back the weight of the snow. The air felt thick, and the earth pressed against him like it wanted to consume him whole. The crackling warmth of the hearth wasn't far now. Eli's fingers brushed the low ceiling as he crawled further, pausing once to check the thickness of the wall. It had to hold. If it didn't, if the earth shifted just a few inches, it would all come down, but it held. And Eli crawled onward, not in fear, but with the quiet, steady resolve of a man who had built for the worst. Finally, after what seemed like hours, he emerged from the trapdoor, pulling himself up into the cabin. The snow piled high above, blocking the daylight, but the hearth was still strong, the flames still crackling. Eli's face was pale beneath the grime, the cold wind lingering in his hair. He set the firewood down beside the stove, lit another match, and set the logs to burn. Outside, the blizzard roared. Inside, Eli Mercer went to work hauling more wood from the tunnel. It wasn't his first time. But tonight, it felt different. Tonight, the wind felt like a promise, not one of mercy, but one of reckoning. 6 weeks earlier, Eli had watched the other settlers scramble to put up their cabins. They rushed to get their homes built before the first snow as fast as they could, with lumber stacked high on every corner. Each of them wanted to get ahead of the storm, to be the one who could throw on the firewood and rest easy. But Eli didn't build that way. While others swung axes and hammered boards, Eli Mercer was digging. The earth was cold and hard, but he dug slow, methodical, his shovel sinking into the frozen ground like the edge of a promise. "You're wasting your time, Eli." William Crawford had called out from his cabin, shaking his head. His hands were calloused from the rush of building and hammering nails into the frame of his new home. "Winter's not here yet, and you're digging like a man about to be buried. Ain't no reason for it." Eli didn't respond. Instead, he knelt on the snow-dusted ground, his hands thick with the weight of his work. Behind him, his barn was half constructed, and his cabin was still just a thought, but beneath it all, Eli was building something that couldn't be seen. The tunnel would hold, he knew. He didn't care what they said. He'd seen winter before, the way it could swallow the land, the way the cold could push its way into a cabin like a snake through a crack. He had known men who had frozen in their homes, thinking their cabins were enough to protect them. But Eli wasn't going to be one of those men. His shovel struck another rock, sending a jolt up his arm. He paused, wiped the sweat from his brow, and glanced toward the other settlers, who were stacking logs without much care. They were already talking about the first snow, the first sign of winter. That would come. But Eli knew that when it did, he would be ready. And if they laughed, if they called him foolish, well, let them. They wouldn't be laughing for long. Eli knew what was coming. The air felt heavier every day. The wind was turning colder. The first leaves had already fallen, and in the high winds, it wasn't just a sign of autumn. The snow would come earlier this year, and when it did, it would be fierce. The others hadn't seen it yet. They didn't know how heavy the storms could be, how fast they could turn deadly. He kept digging. The tunnel took shape slowly, the walls hard and cold beneath his hands. The earth didn't move easily, but Eli worked it into place, carving his own future beneath the snow. He didn't know how long it would take, but he knew it would be worth the effort. By the time the storm hit, when the cold sank into the bones of the land, he would be prepared. And when the others were stuck in their homes, waiting for the blizzards to pass, Eli would be underground, pulling firewood into his cabin with every breath. The snow came early that year. Eli had known it was coming. His instincts never failed him. But before the storm hit, he had to make one last trip into town. The cabin wasn't finished, but his barn was holding steady. He loaded his wagon, hitching his horse with quiet efficiency, as though the very act of preparing kept the world from crumbling. When he rode into town, the streets were quiet. Most folks had already gone to ground, shuttering their windows and stocking up. The air was heavy with the scent of coal smoke and the promise of what was to come. The wind wasn't yet howling, but it would. Eli pulled his coat tight against his neck and made his way to the general store. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside. "Mercer," the clerk said, nodding from behind the counter. "I thought you'd be here before long. The storm's coming in hot. Need to stock up on flour, beans?" "No," Eli said. He placed his orders for kerosene and a few other necessities. But his hands didn't shake, his eyes never wandered. The storm might rage, but Eli was calm. He knew his time was coming. He picked up some extra tools, nails, an extra tarp, more fire starter. The others would have laughed at the amount of supplies, but Eli knew they would soon run out. When the railroad stopped running, when the snow cut them off, they would need more than just a cabin and a fire. They would need foresight. He paid, tipping his hat to the clerk, and turned back toward his wagon. As he walked, he saw a group of men gathered at the saloon. They looked up as Eli passed, their faces laughing and easy despite the wind that was already picking up. "Mercer," called out one of them, a younger man who had just set up a claim near Eli's land. "You ready for the storm, old man?" Eli didn't answer. He didn't need to. Instead, he just tipped his hat again and moved on. His horse was ready, and the wagon was packed. The men could joke. They could laugh. Eli had done the work already. They hadn't. By the time he returned home, the wind was picking up in earnest. The temperature had dropped too, cutting through his coat like a knife. But Eli kept his head down and focused on the path ahead. The town was far behind him now, and the world was growing quieter with each mile. He didn't have to look at the sky to know what was coming. He could feel it. The horse snorted, its breath clouding in the cold air. Eli clicked his tongue and urged it on. He had no time to waste. He would need the kerosene to keep the lamps lit when the snow knocked out the power, and the fire starter would keep his hearth alive. The nails and tarp would help with repairs, but Eli knew he wouldn't need them for a while. Not when the storm had its teeth in, not when it was already too late. Back at the ranch, Eli began to stack the wood for the tunnel. The hole was narrow but deep, the earth packed tight around the edges. Eli had spent weeks digging, reinforcing the walls with timber and stone, making sure the tunnel wouldn't collapse under the weight of the snow. He had no intention of cutting corners. If this was going to save him and the others, he couldn't afford to make mistakes. The firewood didn't look like much at first. Stacked along the tunnel walls, the logs lay in neat, orderly rows, each piece cut precisely, each log stripped of bark. But Eli knew it would be enough. More than enough. It had to be. Each trip to the tunnel was methodical. He didn't rush, didn't waste a single motion. He worked slowly, methodically, dragging the logs by hand from the hidden passage to the cabin's hearth. The earth above was heavy, but the tunnel walls held, and the fire inside burned brightly each time he returned. It wasn't the first time Eli had built for the worst. He had learned long ago that the cold could get inside you, even in the safest of homes. It could creep through cracks, slip past walls, and find its way into your bones. His cabin was sturdy, yes, but when the storms came, Eli knew better than to trust a single structure to keep the cold at bay. The tunnel, hidden beneath the earth, was his lifeline. He had dug it for days, clearing dirt and stone with his hands until the passage was wide enough for his sled and long enough to get the firewood where it needed to go. He didn't talk about it much. Not to the others. Not even to William Crawford, who had watched him with a skeptical eye as he carved out the earth beneath the barn. Eli had tried to explain once, but the old man only scoffed. "Building for an army, are you?" Crawford had asked, shaking his head. "A house is a house, Mercer. You're wasting your time." But Eli knew better. He knew the weight of the cold that could bear down on a man, the way it could steal the strength from your hands and freeze your breath before you could even speak. It wasn't just the snow he was worried about. It was the isolation, the hours spent in darkness, the slow collapse of everything you thought you knew about survival. So Eli kept building. He stacked the wood high, filling the tunnel with as much as it could hold. The last thing he wanted was to run out when the storm hit its worst. Each log was a promise to keep the fire going, to keep the warmth alive, even when the rest of the world seemed to be dying around him. He paused for a moment, his hands resting on the sled, the weight of the logs heavy beneath his fingers. The wind outside was picking up, the snow beginning to swirl against the barn walls. Eli glanced up at the darkening sky. The storm was coming, and when it did, he would be ready. By the time the blizzard hit, Eli was inside, his cabin shuttered against the world. The fire in the hearth burned steady, its crackling warmth filling the air, but the wind outside screamed like a wild thing. Snow battered the windows, and the walls groaned under the pressure of the storm. Eli knew it was only a matter of time before the full fury of the blizzard arrived, but he was ready. The tunnel was stocked, the wood piled high, the sleds were lined up beside the trapdoor, ready to haul the firewood inside when the time came. Eli had always known the storms would come, but this one was different. This one felt colder. This one felt deeper. The winds howled louder than they had before, cutting through the night like 1,000 voices whispering death. He didn't sleep much that night. He could hear the storm tearing through the world outside, its icy fingers reaching through the cracks of the walls. The howling wind made everything feel fragile. The house creaked, the lanterns flickered, and the snow piled deeper by the hour. But Eli didn't flinch. He had built for this. The temperature dropped, sinking below zero as the night dragged on. Eli stoked the fire, feeding it with the wood he had hauled from the tunnel. His hands moved mechanically, the heat from the flames warming his face but never quite reaching his bones. His mind was always on the storm, listening to it, feeling its power press against the walls. When the sun rose, the next morning, it was nearly impossible to tell. The snow had covered everything. The world outside had disappeared under a thick blanket of white, and Eli's cabin was sealed inside a frozen tomb. The wind was still fierce, howling against the walls like a trapped animal. Eli didn't hesitate. He reached for his coat, the thick fur collar pulled high, and his gloves already tucked into his belt. He opened the trapdoor, pulling out the first sled of firewood. He didn't bother with a second glance outside. The snow might have buried the land, but his tunnel was clear. His path was set. Each trip to the tunnel felt longer than the last. The cold outside bit deeper into his bones, the snow making every step a struggle. But Eli was resolute. He kept going back and forth, hauling the firewood through the trapdoor, stacking it inside, feeding the fire until the cabin was warm again. He couldn't waste time. The blizzard was relentless. The world outside had gone silent, but inside, the cabin, the fire burned steady, its warmth a reminder of the preparation that had brought him here. But by midday, Eli knew. He could feel the shift in the air. The storm was only just beginning, and when it reached its peak, He would need all the firewood he could carry. By the fourth day of the storm, Eli's world had shrunk. The cabin, the tunnel, and the fire were the only things that mattered now. The howling wind outside, the way the snow seemed to cover every trace of the land, no longer felt like a distant threat. It was here. It was all around him. The isolation was complete. He didn't check the weather. He didn't need to. The storm was omnipresent, its fury pressing against the windows, its icy breath creeping under the doorframe. Eli had been through enough winters to know what it was capable of. This one was no different. Each time he hauled more firewood through the tunnel, he tried to make it last longer. The sleds piled higher with logs, the heavy weight of each load demanding more of him. But he didn't complain. This was the price he'd paid for being ready. The storm wasn't a surprise. It had been coming. It always came. He moved with careful efficiency, each trip to the tunnel more deliberate than the last. The firewood was already half used, but there was still plenty more below. The tunnel's depth and the work he'd put in to build it were paying off. He could rest for a while before he had to go out again. He would use every piece of wood, every ounce of energy, to keep the cabin warm, to keep himself alive. But as the days wore on, even Eli began to feel the weight of it. The cold seeped into his bones, into his very thoughts. He could hear the storm above, could feel the air press against the walls like it was trying to get inside. But Eli never stopped. The tunnel was his lifeline. That was clear. But what Eli hadn't anticipated was the mental toll of the storm. The isolation wore at him. The endless days of snow, the quiet rhythm of hauling wood, the same routine, the same cold, the same flickering fire. The fire was constant. It was the only thing that kept him grounded. But even it seemed to pale beneath the weight of the storm. Each time he reached for the lantern to light the next match, each time he hauled a sled back to the cabin, it took more effort. He moved slower, his steps heavier. But he never stopped. There was no question of quitting. Eli had prepared for this, had built the tunnel, had stacked the wood, and now he had to carry on. He couldn't afford to rest, not yet. He knew the storm wouldn't stop until it had taken everything it could. It would tear through the land, leave no trace, and when it was done, only the strongest would survive. And Eli was strong. The fire crackled in the hearth, its light casting long shadows across the walls. Eli took another breath, turned, and went back to the tunnel. On the sixth day, just before the storm reached its peak, Eli heard the knock. It came soft at first, like the tap of a stick against the door. At first, he thought it was the wind, rattling the wood with its howl. But then it came again, more insistent this time, and accompanied by a muffled voice calling from outside. "Mercer!" a man shouted, his voice barely rising above the storm. "Mercer, let me in!" Eli froze. He had expected the storm to be relentless, but he hadn't thought about the others. He hadn't thought that anyone would be foolish enough to venture out in this. His mind raced, trying to process the sound. The wind tore through the walls, but the voice was still audible. Someone had lost their way, someone desperate enough to knock on Eli's door. Eli grabbed his rifle and moved toward the trapdoor. He peeked outside through the small window and saw nothing but white. The snow swirled violently, masking everything, hiding even the ground beneath. The knock came again, followed by a scraping sound. The man was desperate, trying to get to shelter. Eli didn't hesitate. He reached for the door handle and pulled it open slowly. The wind slapped him in the face, biting with its frozen breath. The figure outside was barely visible, hunched against the storm. The man's face was half covered in snow, his breath ragged, his clothes soaked. "I'm lost," the man rasped, his words heavy with exhaustion. "I can't make it back. Please." Eli didn't wait for him to finish. He grabbed the man's arm, pulling him inside with a grunt. The door slammed shut behind them, and the cabin seemed to sigh in relief, protected again from the fury outside. The man collapsed on the floor, gasping for air, his body shaking with cold. Eli didn't ask any questions. He lit a lamp, placed it next to the man's head, and moved quickly to the stove. A pot of soup was already simmering, and Eli set it to boil as he removed the man's frozen coat and boots. "You're lucky I heard you," Eli said, his voice calm but firm. "What are you doing out in a storm like this?" The man only shook his head, too tired to respond. He looked about to speak, but the words never came. Eli sat down beside him, watching the firelight dance in the corner. The storm wasn't over yet. Eli could feel it in the air, but for now the cabin was full and the fire was strong. The warmth would save this man's life, but there was still no telling how long the storm would last or how many others would come. The storm raged for another 2 days after the stranger arrived, its grip unrelenting. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled steadily, the warmth a fragile shield against the cold outside. Eli had given the man what little food he had, a bowl of stew that seemed to do more for the spirit than the body. The stranger, whose name was Peter Johnson, had been close to collapse when Eli found him, barely able to speak over the wind. As the days passed, the cabin filled with the sound of low conversation and the crackle of the fire. Johnson was a settler, one of the many who had tried to make a home out here, but the storm had caught him on his way between claims. Eli didn't ask much about his past. The man had been in no condition to answer. But over time, Johnson recovered, his breathing evening out, his hands steadying as he regained some of his strength. On the third day, when the storm showed no sign of abating, Eli knew it was time to open the tunnel again. "I'm going to get more firewood," Eli said, adjusting the thick fur around his neck. The cabin's air was warm, but the cold would be waiting outside. "Stay here. Rest." Johnson nodded, still too weak to argue. Eli had already fed him, and his body was no longer shaking, though his face still looked hollow from the cold. The man's eyes followed Eli as he moved toward the trapdoor. "I won't be gone long," Eli added. "The tunnel's already dug. I'll just pull in a few more loads." He pulled the trapdoor open and disappeared beneath the cabin. The wind howled outside, but Eli felt a calmness in the dark tunnel, the earth cool and still around him. He had dug this tunnel for a reason, and now it was paying off. The logs were stacked neatly in the earth, enough to last through the worst of the storm. Eli worked quickly, using the sled to haul the firewood, moving it from the tunnel to the cabin with practiced ease. Each trip was faster than the last, the routine set in his muscles, the rhythm of survival as steady as his heartbeat. When he emerged with the first load, he saw the surprise in Johnson's eyes. The stranger had been sitting by the fire, eyes drifting to the door, to the storm beyond. But seeing the firewood hauled in with such efficiency without a word, without complaint, he seemed to understand. The tunnel wasn't just for Eli anymore. It was for everyone who needed it. "I don't know how you did this," Johnson said, his voice hoarse. He stood shakily from the chair, moving toward the pile of firewood. Eli didn't answer. There wasn't much to say. The work had been done. The cold outside had already started to feel like a distant memory, tucked away beneath the warmth of the cabin. And as the firelight flickered, Eli knew he would keep hauling, as long as the storm demanded it. The storm had settled into its unrelenting rhythm. By the 7th day, the world outside was a barren, frozen wasteland, an endless sheet of white with no horizon. The wind still howled, but its power had waned. It no longer felt like the beast it had been at first. Now it was just a constant companion, a low, mournful wail that seemed to fill the space between the cabin's walls. Eli didn't mind the quiet. The storm had done what it came to do. It had tested them, made them feel small, made them question their decisions, but they were still here. And for as long as the fire burned, they would stay. But the firewood was starting to run low. It wasn't panic that rose in Eli's chest. He wasn't a man to panic. It was a quiet certainty, a slow realization that the comfort they had built could only last so long. The tunnel had held enough, but each sled load of wood took more effort, more time. The weight of it pressed against his bones, the cold seeping into his muscles as he made trip after trip, hauling the logs, bringing them into the warmth of the cabin. And with each trip, Eli's mind worked. He could feel the weight of time running out. The snow outside, deep as it was, wasn't going to stop them. The tunnel was deep, but not infinite. The fire burned low, and he could see in the flickering light the way the room seemed to close in on them. Johnson had been helping now. He wasn't as strong as Eli, but his hands had steadied with each passing day, his will to survive growing as the storm kept its grip. The man had started to move more purposefully, pulling the sleds along with Eli, hauling wood from the tunnel in a rhythm that felt almost like a dance. But even Johnson, with his renewed strength, knew that the wood would run out soon. And then what? Eli didn't speak of it. There was no need to. The storm was still there, still pressing on them, and the tunnel was still full. For now, they would keep going. For now, there was still fire. They worked in silence, the heavy scrape of the sleds the only sound between them. The heat from the fire pushed back the worst of the cold, but the edges of Eli's coat still felt damp, the chill of the earth beneath him, always a reminder that the world outside was still as deadly as it had been 7 days ago. The logs would hold out a little longer, just a little longer. Eli glanced toward the door, where the wind rattled it like a warning. His mind flicked to the others, to the settlers who hadn't built tunnels, to the ones who weren't ready. He could only hope they were faring as well as he was. But the wood was running low, and soon the storm would stop. And when it did, they would face whatever came next. The storm broke on the 10th day. The wind that had howled against the cabin's walls for so long finally stilled, and the world outside, suffocated beneath feet of snow, seemed to exhale. The air felt different, softer somehow, though still cold. The snow continued to fall in light flurries, but the fury of the blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world muted and heavy. Eli stood by the window, staring out into the white haze. For a long time, he didn't move. The fire in the hearth crackled behind him, its warmth a steady presence in the quiet room. He had been waiting for this moment, the stillness after the storm, the silence that followed the chaos. But something in the air felt different. He could sense the change even before it arrived. The thaw. The ground outside, once frozen and rigid, had begun to soften, the deep, powdery snow melting into slush. Eli knew that the worst of it was over. They had survived. He could feel the weight of those words pressing against him in the same way the cold had. He could feel the last of the firewood pile being used, the last sled load of logs pulled from the tunnel. The warmth would hold for a while longer, but after that they would need to make do with what they had left. "Looks like it's over," Eli muttered to himself, rubbing his hands over his face. The strange weight of relief mixed with exhaustion settled deep in his bones. They were alive. That was all that mattered. He could hear the faint creak of the roof as the snow above began to melt. The days ahead would be different, quieter, but the past 10 days had carved a place into his memory that wouldn't fade. Johnson moved toward him, his steps slow and unsteady, still regaining his strength. He had been a quiet companion, sitting by the fire when not helping with the wood. There was a shared understanding between them. They had both seen the harshness of the frontier and understood how close they had come to losing everything. "It's over, then?" Johnson asked, his voice raw from days of near silence. Eli nodded without looking away from the window. For now. But even as he said it, he knew the world would never feel the same. The storm had taught them both a lesson about survival, about the quiet effort of preparing for the worst. It had also shown Eli something else. He wasn't alone, not anymore. The earth outside groaned as it began to thaw, the weight of the snow shifting beneath the surface. The sounds of cracking ice and shifting earth were a reminder that winter had not yet fully loosened its grip. Eli knew it would take time before the land would truly thaw, before they could go outside without fear of another storm. But for now, it didn't matter. They had survived. Eli turned from the window and walked back to the hearth, the heat from the fire wrapping around him like an old friend. He took a deep breath, the first one in days that didn't feel heavy with the storm. They had made it.